I'm going to be presenting the results of my MSc work, studying the role of these late transverse faults as they pertain to gold mineralization, particularly looking at the Maskinonge Lake fault. This is supervised by Schiffer Lin and Chris Yakimchuk at the University of Waterloo. And I also want to give a big thanks to Carl Nagy and Michelle Cote and the rest of the Island Gold team at Alamos for really helping this project along and making it really all possible. So just a quick overview of the problem. Why are we interested in these structures? So most gold deposits in the Superior Province, such as the Island Gold Deposit, are hosted in east-west striking shear zones. Late transverse faults tend to occur at a high angle to these shear zones, and they've been observed with local gold enrichment, but they're underexplored, and so therefore their significance isn't really understood. The Maskinonge Lake fault, toward the east of the Island Gold Deposit, is one of these zones with local enrichment, and it presents a great opportunity to study these structures and their role in gold mineralization. You see here's a couple zones of enrichment on this fault here. So we take a step out to the broader geologic context. The Superior Province is composed of terrains that amalgamated through north-south accretionary events that result in broadly east-west striking terrain boundaries. And gold deposits across the Superior typically occur in greenstone belts that developed during this time, and therefore they're structurally controlled by their terrain boundaries. This means that the majority of gold deposits are hosted in east-west trending shear zones, subparallel to these boundaries. You can see on this figure here, a number of these major east-west striking shear zones with some of the highest producing gold deposits in all of Canada. This is a map of the Wawa-Abitibi terrain, and we're going to be focusing mostly on the Michipicoten Greenstone Belt. This is a historic gold-producing region in the western Wawa terrain within the southern Superior Province here. Here we can see some three major bimodal volcanic assemblages dated at 2900 MA, 2750, and 2700. Now, these cycles tend to be separated by laterally extensive iron sulfide and iron oxide rich units. Metamorphism in this area typically reaches around green schist up to lower amphibolite facies. And within this greenstone belt is the Goudreau Lake deformation zone. This is a sigmoidal deformation zone that occurs along the major contact between the felsic rocks and the mafic rocks. And many of the gold deposits in the Michipicoten Greenstone Belt, including the Island Gold Deposit here, the Magino deposit hosted in the Webb Lake Stock, the historic Edwards Mine to the east, these are all found in this deformation zone. Previous workers have observed 3 deformation events, D1 to D3, in this zone that have been followed by northwest trending faults, and these typically offset stratigraphy with an apparent sinistral shear sense. Now, obviously, these northwest structures are the main focus of this thesis, especially the Maskinonge Lake fault. So, as I mentioned, the Maskinonge Lake fault crosscuts the Goudreau Lake deformation zone with that apparent sinistral offset, especially when you use the Morrison unit and the Pine unit there. A diabase dike outcrops locally along this fault. It's assumed to be Metachuan age, so around 2450 million years old. But most notably, this fault is populated with zones of pervasive silicification and gold enrichment along its strike. So the main objectives of this work was, 1, to characterize the kinematics, extent, and geometry of the Maskinonge Lake fault. 2 is to evaluate the relationships between that structure and the gold enrichment that we see. And 3 is to incorporate those findings into the larger geological context of the Michipicoten Greenstone Belt and potentially elsewhere in the Superior. So the outcomes of this obviously would be a comprehensive structural analysis of the Maskinonge Lake fault, a better understanding of the relative timing and controls on gold mineralization, and to develop a criteria for exploration around similar structures in the area, as there are a decent number of these northwest trending faults around here. So the main study area is focused on the Maskinonge Lake fault, which divides our area into a northeast and southeast block. The northeast block contains the contact between the 2750 million-year-old felsic rocks and the 2700 million-year-old mafic rocks, which is all juxtaposed against 2700 million-year-old rocks on the southwest block. And a lot of the structural features that we see here, such as the foliation, the lineation, and shear zones, are those that are typical of the Goudreau Lake Deformation Zone. However, the orientation of these features differs on each block. So we can see on the northeast block, we have an east-northeast trending and striking orientation, but on the southwest block, it's more of a north-northeast trend. This difference in orientation could be due to rotation associated with the fault, but it may also reflect the earlier deformation patterns from the Goudreau Lake Deformation Zone, some of which we do see in our study area. So these are all structures that relate to the Goudreau Lake Deformation Zone. They occur pre-faulting, and so they're not really the focus of this research, but as they are seen in the field area, they do provide some essential geologic context for the Maskinonge Lake Fault. Our first event is D1, defined by upright kilometer scale folding from north-south compression. The scale of this is too big to be seen in our study area, but it is present and has been seen at the Island Gold deposit. D2 is what creates our dominant fabric that we see throughout the Goudreau Lake Deformation Zone. It's this steeply dipping east-northeast striking foliation, S2. Mineralization that is found at the larger gold deposits like Island Gold and Magino is thought to occur sin D2. And D3 is defined by local isoclinal Z folds in the S2 fabric and the contacts between quartz feldspar porphyry dikes and the Mayfield Country Rock. So these field photos show that relationship well. We can see S2 foliation being folded by F3, as well as F3 folding the contact of these QFP dikes. So we get into the structures that are directly related to the Maskinonge Lake Fault. D4 is our first deformation event. Here we see crenulations and kink folds overprinting earlier S2 foliation, creating a axial plane that is subvertical northwest or southeast striking. That's our S4 foliation. The intersection between S4 and S2 tends to develop a strong pencil cleavage as we get into more strongly deformed areas closer to the Maskinonge Lake Fault. L4 lineations that we see on the S4 plains are subhorizontal to shallowly plunging towards the northwest, generally 5 to 10 degrees towards 320. And on the larger map pattern, dextral movement along the Maskinonge Lake Fault results in the drag of S2 foliation and those shear zones and felsic dikes. So this tells us that D4 occurred under dextral shearing. This fault was reactivated during D5 deformation, which corresponded with brittle ductile shearing. D5 is our most important stage for gold mineralization, as this stage not only corresponds with the emplacement of northwest striking laminated quartz veins, but also zones of pervasive silica alteration along the fault. And I'll get into those later. These veins, though, they're subvertical, parallel with the Maskinonge Lake Fault, and they show shear sense indicators of sinistral shearing. And we can analyze the relationship between these V2 veins and echelon veins associated with them to understand a little bit more about the fault kinematics during D5. So by plotting the poles to these veins and their echelon veins, we can create a girdle that when we project it onto the plane of the Maskinonge Lake Fault, it gives a shear vector of about 12 degrees towards 320, which is essentially subhorizontal. This is subparallel to the L4 stretching lineations, shown in the blue crosses, which suggests that D4 and D5 may have shared a shear direction. And this also implies that movement in these deformation events was dominantly strike-slip with very little to no vertical movement. The V2E poles tend to plot greater than 45 degrees to the shear zone boundary, the Maskinonge Lake Fault, which suggests that D5 was sinistral and transgressional. Finally, D5 was overprinted by brittle deformation in D6. On the larger scale, this movement resulted in the sinistral offset of the stratigraphy that we see on the map by approximately 1 kilometer, which is apparent using the pirate-rich sulfide units. And on a local scale, the silica-altered wall rock is brecciated in this zone with clasts of up to 15 centimeters large, hosted in a sort of fine-grained cataclastic matrix. D6 is also associated with this conjugate joint pattern, creating these fracture networks that offset the quartz veins and the silica alteration with conjugate symmetry. So this is a simplified top-down model of those three events, D4 to D6, that are associated with movement along the Maskinonge Lake Fault. It shows the evolution of the fault as it transitions from ductile into brittle deformation, as well as their timing relationship with gold mineralization. So you can see D4 is ductile, showing that dextral drag of the earlier S2 foliation into the fault. This is followed by the sinistral reactivation of the fault during D5, corresponding with the emplacement of these V2 veins, as well as the pervasive silicification along the strike of the fault. D6 faulting then resulted in the brecciation and fracturing of SIN D5 features, as well as our kilometer scale offset of stratigraphy. And this block diagram shows a sort of 3D model of the fault as it stands now. It highlights this sort of subvertical northwest striking orientation of the fault, very vertical, dominantly strike slip, and it clearly shows the result of 3 stages of movement. And one area where we see all of these events really well is the Pine Breccia outcrop. And this is a 200-meter long outcrop exposed mostly along the northeast block of the Maskinonge Lake Fault. It encompasses a section of a contact between the 2750 million-year-old felsic rocks and 2700 million-year-old mafic rocks in the north, intruded by quartz porphyry dikes, as well as containing S2 parallel shear zones that populate the sort of northern end of this outcrop. And you'll note that the dextral drag of the shear zones and the dikes is very apparent on this map here, sort of a main indicator of that D4 dextral shearing. We also have the diabase dike that occurs parallel to the Maskinonge Lake Fault on the southwest block here. But the main feature of this outcrop is on the east side, we have this gold-bearing alteration zone extending the entire length of the outcrop, about 3 meters from the Maskinonge Lake Fault, that I've divided into a strongly altered main vein and a moderately altered silica halo that transitions into an array of northwest trending V2 quartz veins, so all of which are parallel with the Maskinonge Lake Fault. So here you can see the clear divide between the main vein and the silica halo. The main vein replaces the mafic volcanic texture with a massive crystalline quartz, while the silica halo is strongly sheared with boudinage quartz veinlets and some sinistral quartz shear bands. And the silica alteration tends to be very closely tied to mineralization. As we will see here, we have 4 figures that show silica, gold, copper, and sulfur plotted against the distance from the fault. And these are a bunch of samples that were collected as part of Alamos's channel sampling program across the entire outcrop. We can see clearly that gold, silica, and copper all tend to be enriched within 2 to 3 meters from the fault, and this corresponds with the main vein and silica halo. Sulfur, which you would expect to be enriched as well, is anomalously not, and is instead more or less consistently low across the outcrop. In reflected light, we can see clearly that gold is associated with chalcopyrite, which is by far the most dominant sulfide in the main vein. Well, pyrite is less commonly associated with these, and the lack of sulfur enrichment that we see here may just be a reflection of that. So these figures show histograms of gold concentrations from the channel samples against now both the distance from the fault as well as the rock types or silica alteration level. And although we can see that gold is restricted strongly to the main vein and the silica halo, the distribution of the gold is not homogeneous. So we have grades that range from 2, about 2 to upwards of 30 ppm of gold, all within a 10-meter interval of strike. So it turns out that the highest grades of gold are found near the intersection of the Maskinonge Lake Fault and these east-northeast S2 parallel shear zones. And channel samples across these shear zones tend to return anywhere from 0.5 to 5 ppm of gold, which isn't very high, but it does suggest that these east-northeast striking shear zones might be a secondary structural control on gold enrichment. So this is a conceptual model that predicts the location and plunge of high-grade ore zones within the main vein, which again forms SIN D5. Since the highest grades are found at the intersection between the shear zones and the main vein, the predicted plunge of mineralization is essentially parallel to the line of intersection between the two, as you can see on this STERInet here. Mineralization here is predicted to plunge 73 degrees towards 320, or steeply dipping towards the northwest. And it's about 60 degrees steeper than our D5 shear direction. And so using the findings from this, the Pine Breccia gold occurrence, can develop a set of criteria for, other favorable exploration targets, not only along the Maskinonge Lake fault, but other late northwest faults in the area, because there are a decent amount of them. The first criteria being that they're found along strike of high angle faults to these regional structural trends. These faults act as a dominant conduit for fluids, as we can see with the main vein at Pine Breccia. But we also see along strike two other subsidiary gold occurrences, the Clement occurrence and the Michael Syndicate shaft. The second criteria is this intersection with east-northeast striking shear zones and the major faults. So although these major faults act as conduits, it's the intersection of the shear zones that may be the essential factor into localizing the high-grade economic mineralization. And three being the proximity to competent felsic dikes. This is more of a modifier to point two, but within proximity of these felsic dikes, especially along contacts, you get stronger shearing, likely due to a competency contrast during deformation. This is the proposed model for the Island Gold deposit, where a competency contrast between a resistive large body stock and the surrounding volcanic rocks created a strain shadow. So it's a similar sort of model, just on a smaller scale. And using this criteria, I've identified high potential and low potential targets. High potential targets meet all of the criteria, where lower potential targets only meet a couple, but they're still prospective targets for exploration. So in conclusion then, the Maskinonge Lake fault is a subvertical northwest strike slip fault that records 3 stages of deformation that transition from brittle into ductile, ductile into brittle. D4 is a dextral ductile shearing that corresponds with the initiation of the Maskinonge Lake fault, and it develops as northwest striking subvertical S4 foliation parallel with the fault. D5 is a reactivation of the fault during sinistral brittle ductile shearing, corresponding with silica alteration and the emplacement of V2 quartz veins. D6 is brittle faulting that resulted in the brecciation of D5 veins, as well as the resultant sinistral offset that we see on a larger regional scale. Gold mineralization at Pine Breccia occurred sin D5. The absolute timing of this is unknown, but it must have occurred prior to D6 deformation. The gold is associated with elevated silica and copper. Copper in particular makes this deposit unique to the nearby Island Gold deposit, where we don't see huge enrichment in copper. And although gold is controlled by the main vein, it is unevenly distributed along the strike of the Maskinonge Lake fault. It's instead enhanced by intersecting structural features, such as those east-west striking S2 parallel shear zones, which create a sort of focal point for mineralized fluids. But above all, the main takeaway is that transverse faults occur at a high angle to major gold-bearing shear zones, and they may host late mineralization, which makes them, viable targets for gold exploration. So with that, thanks all for listening. Thanks for Taos and the MDD for the award and for inviting me to give the presentation. And I look forward to any questions.